The dust-stained windows of Lusk's only church rattled as thunder rolled across the Wyoming sky, but the laughter inside drowned out nature's warning. Georgina Lawson knelt at the altar, hands clasped in desperate prayer, ignoring the jeers and taunts of the 5 men who had followed her inside. Their mockery echoed through the empty sanctuary as tears streamed down her dirt-smudged face. "Please," she whispered, "send someone to help me." The men's laughter grew louder. "Ain't no one coming for you, Miss Lawson," drawled Silas Weaver, the ringleader of the group. "Your pa's debts are due, and if he ain't paying, you're coming with us to settle accounts." Georgina squeezed her eyes shut tighter, her knuckles white with strain. The door to the church burst open with a crash that silenced the room. Before she could open her eyes, the sound of heavy boots strode purposefully down the aisle. "I believe the lady isn't interested in your company, gentlemen." The voice was deep, calm, and carried an unmistakable threat. Georgina's eyes flew open to see a tall figure standing between her and her tormentors. Broad-shouldered and trail-worn, he stood with a quiet confidence that made even Silas take a step back. "This ain't your business, stranger," Silas spat, though his hand hovered uncertainly near his holster. "I'm making it my business." The stranger didn't raise his voice, but his hand rested casually on his gun belt. "Now, I suggest you boys find the door before I lose my patience." Silas looked at his companions, weighing their options. After a tense moment, he jerked his head toward the door. "This ain't over," he muttered, but the men filed out, throwing venomous glances over their shoulders. Only when the church door slammed shut did Georgina release the breath she'd been holding. The stranger turned to face her, and she found herself looking into the most striking pair of blue eyes she'd ever seen. "Are you hurt, madam?" he asked, removing his hat to reveal thick, dark hair. "No," she managed, struggling to her feet. "Thank you, mister." "Preston Irvine," he replied with a slight tip of his head. "Just passing through Lusk when I heard the commotion." Georgina brushed dust from her skirts, painfully aware of her disheveled appearance after running through half the town to seek sanctuary. "Georgina Lawson, I don't know how to thank you." Preston's weathered face softened into a small smile. "No need for thanks. I couldn't very well ride past a lady in distress." He glanced toward the door. "Though I get the feeling those men will be back. Mind telling me what that was about?" Georgina hesitated, shame coloring her cheeks. "My father. He's been gambling again. He borrowed money from Silas Weaver and his gang. When he couldn't pay, they decided I would settle the debt." Preston's jaw tightened. No man worth his salt collects debts that way. He settled his hat back on his head. "Where's your father now?" "At our ranch about 5 miles east of town." "He doesn't know I came to town today." She tucked a stray strand of auburn hair behind her ear. "I shouldn't have, but we needed supplies." "Let me escort you home, Miss Lawson," Preston offered, his eyes scanning the windows as if expecting Silas to reappear. "Those men didn't strike me as the type to give up easily." Georgina knew she should decline. Accepting help from a stranger wasn't proper, but the thought of facing Silas and his gang alone terrified her more than impropriety. "Thank you, Mr. Irvine. I'd be most grateful." Outside the church, Preston's horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion, stood patiently beside Georgina's wagon. The sky had darkened further, promising rain before they could reach the Lawson ranch. "We'd best hurry," Preston said, helping her onto the wagon seat before mounting his horse. "That storm's not going to wait." As they left Lusk behind, Georgina couldn't help wondering what twist of fate had brought this mysterious cowboy to her rescue, arriving at the exact moment of her desperate prayer. Whatever the reason, she thanked God for sending Preston Irvine before she'd even opened her eyes. The rain started falling when they were halfway to the Lawson ranch. Large droplets quickly turned to sheets of water, drenching Georgina despite the wagon's small canopy. Preston, riding alongside, was soaked to the skin but showed no sign of discomfort. "There's a line shack up ahead," he called over the downpour. "Used to belong to the Carlton spread before they sold out. Might be best to wait out the worst of it there." Georgina nodded, her hands stiff on the reins. The old Carlton line shack appeared through the curtain of rain, weathered but still standing. Preston dismounted swiftly, tying his horse under the small lean-to before helping Georgina down from the wagon. Inside, the shack was dusty but dry. Preston found an old lantern and lit it, the soft glow revealing a single room with a small stove, a rough-hewn table, and a narrow cot. "Not exactly the Cheyenne Hotel," he said with a wry smile, "but it'll do until this passes." Georgina stood awkwardly by the door, water dripping from her sodden dress. "Thank you. I don't know what I would have done if—" "No need to think about that now." Preston busied himself with the stove, finding enough kindling to start a small fire. "You should try to dry out. Catch your death otherwise." He turned his back politely as Georgina removed her outer shawl and hung it near the stove. The silence between them grew uncomfortable as the rain hammered on the roof. "You're not from around here," Georgina observed, trying to ease the tension. Preston nodded, still facing away from her. "Been drifting since the war. Spent some time in Montana, then Colorado. Just following work where I can find it." "The war?" Georgina asked softly. "You fought for the Union?" "Yes, madam. Cavalry under Sherman." His voice grew distant. "Seems like another lifetime now." The stove began to warm the small space, and Georgina felt some feeling return to her fingers. "And what brings you to Lusk, Mr. Irvine?" Preston turned, his face half in shadow. "Heard the Rocking M was looking for hands. Thought I might try my luck there." "Malcolm Morris's spread?" Georgina smiled slightly. "He's a fair man. My father used to work for him before." She trailed off, not wanting to elaborate on her father's decline. "Before the gambling?" Preston finished gently. Georgina nodded, looking down at her hands. "After my mother passed, 4 years ago, Pa just changed. Started drinking, then gambling. We had our own small place once, but he's lost most of it. We're down to 40 acres now, and that's only because it's in my mother's name." Preston watched her, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry. Grief makes men do foolish things." "You sound like you speak from experience," Georgina observed. A shadow passed over his face. "Everyone's lost something in this life, Miss Lawson." The rain began to ease, tapping more gently on the roof. Georgina moved to the window, peering out at the clearing sky. "I should get home before Pa worries." Preston nodded, dousing the small fire in the stove. "I'll see you safely there." As they continued toward the Lawson ranch, the landscape washed clean by the rain, Georgina found herself stealing glances at her silent companion. Preston Irvine was a mystery, a wandering cowboy with educated speech and the bearing of a man who had seen too much. She wondered what demons drove him to drift from place to place, never settling. The Lawson ranch came into view, a modest house with a small barn and corral, everything showing signs of neglect. As they approached, a thin, gray-haired man emerged from the house, squinting against the fading daylight. "Georgina, where in tarnation have you been?" Harold Lawson's voice was slurred, and he swayed slightly on the porch. "And who's this fella?" Preston dismounted, standing respectfully at the edge of the yard. "Preston Irvine, sir. I had the pleasure of escorting your daughter home after the weather turned." Harold's bloodshot eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Didn't ask for no escort." "Pa, please," Georgina said quietly, climbing down from the wagon. Mr. Irvine was kind enough to help me when Silas Weaver and his men cornered me in town. Harold's face paled beneath his weathered tan. Weaver was in town? Did he say anything about the money? He said the debt is due, Pa. Georgina couldn't keep the disappointment from her voice. He and his men followed me into the church. If Mr. Irvine hadn't come along when he did. Harold's shoulders sagged. He looked suddenly older, the weight of his failures visibly crushing him. I'll figure something out, Georgie. I promise. Preston cleared his throat. Mr. Lawson, if I might make a suggestion, the Rocking M is hiring hands. Good wages for honest work. Harold bristled. You saying I don't do honest work, mister? No, sir, Preston replied evenly. Just offering information that might be useful. Georgina gave Preston a grateful look before turning to her father. Pa, we need to do something. Weaver won't wait much longer. Harold ran a hand through his thinning hair. Malcolm Morris wouldn't hire me back. Not after. Well, you know. Then I'll go, Georgina said firmly. Mr. Morris always said I had a way with horses. Maybe he'd take me on to help with training. Absolutely not. Harold's voice rose. No daughter of mine is going to work as a ranch hand. Preston spoke up again. There might be another option, Mr. Lawson. I'd be willing to help clear your debt with Weaver, in exchange for room and board while I work at the Rocking M. Both Lawsons stared at him in disbelief. Why would you do that? Harold asked, suspicion written across his face. Preston's gaze flickered to Georgina before returning to her father. Let's just say I've been on the wrong side of men like Weaver before. No one should have to deal with their kind of justice. Georgina's heart raced as she studied the mysterious cowboy. His offer seemed too good to be true, yet she sensed no deception in his clear blue eyes. We couldn't possibly accept, she began. But her father cut her off. How much money are we talking about, Irvine? Harold asked, desperation overtaking pride. Pa! Georgina gasped. How much does Weaver say you owe? Preston countered. Harold swallowed hard. $200. Preston nodded, as if the sum was exactly what he'd expected. I can cover that, but I have conditions. Name 'em, Harold said quickly. First, you stop gambling. Completely. Preston's voice hardened. Second, you start putting work into this ranch again. And third, you treat your daughter with the respect she deserves. Harold's face flushed with anger and shame. You've got a lot of nerve, stranger. Pa, please, Georgina pleaded. Mr. Irvine is trying to help us. Harold looked between his daughter's earnest face and Preston's resolute one. Finally, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Fine. Your conditions are fair, Irvine. God knows I've been a poor excuse for a father lately. Relief flooded Georgina, though uncertainty quickly followed. This arrangement would mean having Preston Irvine living on their property, a man she'd known for mere hours. Yet something told her she could trust him, that behind his guarded demeanor was a man of honor. It's settled then, Preston said, extending his hand to Harold, who shook it after a moment's hesitation. I'll ride into town tomorrow and settle with Weaver. You can take the spare room in the barn, Harold offered. It ain't much, but it's dry. That'll do fine, Preston nodded. I'll see to my horse, then help unload those supplies. As the men moved toward the barn, Georgina stood rooted to the spot, trying to process the day's events. This morning, she'd been terrified that Weaver would collect on her father's debt by taking her. Now, a stranger had ridden into their lives, offering salvation with a generosity she couldn't fathom. Thank you, she whispered, though Preston was too far away to hear. Thank you for coming before I open my eyes. The following morning, Georgina rose before dawn, her mind still spinning with thoughts of their unusual arrangement. She dressed quickly and moved to the kitchen to prepare breakfast, surprised to find the stove already lit and coffee brewing. Preston stood at the counter, slicing bread. He looked up as she entered, offering a nod. "Hope you don't mind. Used to early starts in the army." "Not at all," Georgina replied, flustered by his thoughtfulness. "Though you're our guest, you shouldn't have to cook." "Not a guest. We made a deal." Preston poured her a cup of coffee and slid it across the table. "Besides, I've been fending for myself a long time. Don't mind sharing the load." Georgina accepted the coffee gratefully, studying him in the soft morning light. With his beard freshly trimmed and hair combed back, Preston looked less like the trail-worn drifter of yesterday and more like the cavalry officer he'd once been. "You're really planning to pay Weaver today?" she asked. Preston nodded, turning back to the stove. "The sooner that debt's cleared, the better for everyone." "I don't understand why you're doing this," Georgina admitted. "You don't know us." Preston was quiet for a long moment, cracking eggs into a pan. "Sometimes a man needs to balance his ledger, Miss Lawson. Let's leave it at that." Before Georgina could press further, her father shuffled into the kitchen, looking haggard but sober. He nodded awkwardly to Preston before taking a seat at the table. "Figured you'd be gone by now," Harold muttered. "Realized what a fool's bargain you made." "I don't make bargains I don't intend to keep," Preston replied evenly, placing plates of eggs and bread on the table. The three ate in uncomfortable silence until Harold finally spoke again. "I'll come with you to town. Weaver's less likely to cause trouble if we're both there." Preston considered this, then nodded. "Agreed. But I do the talking." After breakfast, the men prepared to leave for town. Georgina walked them to where their horses were saddled, anxiety tightening her chest. "Be careful," she urged. "Weaver won't like being paid off. He wanted more than money." Preston's expression darkened. "All the more reason to settle this now." He mounted his chestnut, then looked down at her with unexpected gentleness. "We'll be back before sundown, Miss Lawson. Try not to worry." As they rode away, Georgina returned to the house, determined to make it more welcoming for their return. She spent the day cleaning, baking, and repairing what she could. The work kept her hands busy, though her mind continued to puzzle over Preston Irvine and his mysterious motivations. The sun was beginning its descent when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Wiping flour from her hands, she hurried outside, relief washing over her at the sight of both men returning unharmed. "It's done," Preston announced as he dismounted. "Weaver's been paid in full, with witnesses present." Harold nodded, looking both relieved and ashamed. "Irvine handled it better than I could have. Made sure Weaver signed a receipt and everything." "He give you any trouble?" Georgina asked, noting a bruise forming on Preston's jaw. "Nothing worth mentioning," Preston replied, though the hardness in his eyes told a different story. That evening, over the meal Georgina had prepared, the atmosphere was notably lighter. Harold even refrained from his usual evening whiskey, instead sharing stories about the ranch in better days. "Used to run nearly 100 head of cattle," he recalled, a wistful note in his voice. "Before the drought of '68 took most of them." "The land could support that again," Preston observed. "With work." "Maybe," Harold conceded, "though it would take money we don't have." "Start small," Preston suggested. "Build back slowly." Georgina watched the exchange with growing hope. For the first time in years, her father was talking about the future instead of drowning in the past. After dinner, Preston excused himself to the barn, leaving father and daughter alone. Harold sat heavily in his chair by the fireplace, staring into the flames. "He's a good man, your cowboy," Harold said finally. Georgina felt heat rise to her cheeks. He's not my cowboy, Pa. Harold raised an eyebrow. Maybe not yet, but I've seen how you look at him, and how he looks at you when he thinks no one's watching. Pa, please, Georgina protested, though her heart quickened at the suggestion. He's just being kind. Harold shook his head. Men like Preston Irvine don't cross states and pay off strangers' debts out of simple kindness. There's something else driving him. He looked at his daughter meaningfully. Or someone. Georgina didn't know how to respond. The idea that Preston might harbor feelings for her after such a brief acquaintance seemed impossible. Yet she couldn't deny the strange connection she felt to him, as if they'd known each other much longer than a day. Whatever his reasons, Harold continued, I'm grateful he came along, and I mean to keep my word to him. No more gambling. He pulled a flask from his pocket and handed it to Georgina. And no more of this either. Tears sprang to Georgina's eyes as she took the flask. It had been her mother's last gift to her father, a silver flask engraved with his initials. For years it had never left his pocket. Oh, Pa, she whispered, embracing him. I've been a poor excuse for a father since your mother died, Harold admitted, his voice rough with emotion. But that ends now. If Irvine can start fresh, so can I. Later that night, unable to sleep, Georgina stood on the porch, watching the moon rise over the distant hills. The sound of a guitar, softly played, drifted from the barn. Drawn by the melody, she wrapped her shawl tighter and followed the music. Preston sat on a hay bale near the barn door, his fingers moving skillfully over the strings of an old guitar. He looked up as she approached, but didn't stop playing. I hope I'm not disturbing anyone, he said. Not at all, Georgina assured him. I didn't know you played. Preston's mouth quirked in a half-smile. One of the few possessions I've kept with me. Music helps when the nights get too quiet. Georgina settled on another bale, a respectful distance away. You play beautifully. What was that song? Just something I picked up during the war, Preston replied, his fingers still moving over the strings. Nothing special. It sounds special to me, Georgina said softly. Preston's hands stilled on the guitar. He looked at her, really looked at her, for what felt like the first time. Your father agreed to ride to the Rocking M with me tomorrow. See about work for both of us. That's wonderful, Georgina said, genuinely surprised. He hasn't set foot on the Morris Ranch since. Since he was fired? Preston finished when she trailed off. He told me. Said he was drunk. Got into a fight with the foreman. Georgina nodded, embarrassed. It was right after my mother died. Pa wasn't himself. Grief can change a man, Preston said, his eyes distant. Make him forget who he is for a time. You sound like you know something about that, Georgina observed gently. Preston set the guitar aside. I lost my wife and son during the war. Fever took them while I was away fighting. Georgina's heart constricted. I'm so sorry, Preston. It was the first time she'd used his given name, and the intimacy of it hung in the air between them. When I came home to Tennessee and found them gone, Preston continued, his voice low, I couldn't stay. Sold everything but this guitar and my horse, and started riding. Been moving ever since. For how long? Georgina asked. 6 years now. Preston's gaze met hers. Never stayed anywhere longer than a season. Georgina considered this. What makes you think Lusk will be any different? Preston looked up at the star-filled Wyoming sky. I don't know that it will be, but for the first time in a long while, I'm curious to find out. The moments stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibility. Finally, Georgina stood, knowing propriety demanded she return to the house. Thank you for sharing your music, she said. And your story. Preston nodded. Good night, Georgina. As she walked back to the house, Georgina knew something fundamental had shifted. Preston Irvine had shared part of himself with her, revealing the pain that drove his wandering. And in doing so, he'd opened a door that neither of them might be able to close again. The following weeks brought changes to the Lawson ranch that Georgina had scarcely dared to hope for. True to his word, Harold had secured work at the Rocking M, with Malcolm Morris cautiously giving him a second chance. Preston too had been hired, his skill with horses quickly earning the respect of the other hands. Each evening, the men would return from the Rocking M, and slowly, the Lawson ranch began to transform. Fences were mended, the barn roof repaired, and Harold even brought home 2 young heifers as the start of a new herd. Georgina found herself looking forward to the evenings, when Preston would sometimes play his guitar or share stories of places he'd seen in his travels. Though he never spoke again of his lost family, she sensed that the sharp edges of his grief were gradually softening. One Saturday morning in late April, Preston approached Georgina as she hung laundry behind the house. "Malcolm's wife is holding a social at the ranch tonight," he said, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "Dancing, food. The whole town's invited." Georgina paused, a sheet half pinned to the line. "Yes, Mrs. Morris always hosts a spring social." Preston cleared his throat. "I was wondering if you might want to attend. With me." Georgina's heart skipped. This was the first time Preston had suggested anything resembling courtship. "Like, as your escort." "If you'd like," Preston said, his usual confidence momentarily faltering. "Your father's already agreed to go." Georgina smiled, trying to contain her excitement. "Then yes, I'd be happy to attend with you." The smile that spread across Preston's face transformed him, erasing years of hardship in an instant. "I'll hitch up the wagon at 6. That evening, Georgina stood before the small mirror in her bedroom, assessing her appearance with critical eyes. She'd worn her best dress, a blue calico that brought out the auburn highlights in her hair, which she'd arranged in a simple but elegant knot at the nape of her neck. Her mother's cameo pendant, the only piece of jewelry she owned, adorned her throat. Touching it gently, Georgina wondered what her mother would think of Preston Irvine. She liked to believe her mother would approve of the quiet cowboy who had brought hope back to their home. The sound of the wagon arriving pulled her from her thoughts. Taking a deep breath, Georgina descended to the main room where her father waited. "You look just like your mother," Harold said, his voice thick with emotion. "She'd be proud of the woman you've become, Georgie." "Thank you, Pa," Georgina replied, touched by the rare sentiment. Outside, Preston stood beside the wagon, dressed in clean dark trousers and a pressed white shirt, his usual trail-worn clothes replaced for the occasion. He removed his hat as Georgina emerged, his expression one of genuine appreciation. "You look beautiful, Miss Lawson," he said simply. The ride to the Rocking M was filled with anticipation. The Morris Ranch, the largest in the county, was ablaze with lanterns as they approached. Wagons and horses filled the yard, and the sound of fiddle music drifted through the evening air. Eliza Morris, Malcolm's wife, greeted them warmly. "Harold Lawson, it's been too long. And Georgina, my dear, how lovely you look." She turned to Preston with an approving smile. "Mr. Irvine, Malcolm tells me you're quite the horseman." "Mrs. Morris is too kind," Preston replied politely. "Your husband runs a fine operation." "Well, you're all very welcome," Eliza said, ushering them toward the barn, which had been cleared for dancing. "There's food on the tables and punch in the corner. Enjoy yourselves." Inside, the barn had been transformed. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm glow over the proceedings. A small band played on a raised platform, while couples twirled across the floor. "Would you care to dance?" Preston asked, offering Georgina his arm. "I'd love to," she replied, allowing him to lead her to the floor. Preston proved to be a surprisingly graceful dancer, guiding her through a waltz with confident steps. "Where did a drifting cowboy learn to dance like this?" Georgina asked, impressed. A shadow of sadness crossed Preston's face. "My wife, Emily, loved to dance. We'd practice in our parlor after supper." Georgina's heart ached for him. "Tell me about her," she said softly. Preston was quiet for a moment, as if deciding how much to share. "She was kind, laughed easily, taught school before we married." His voice grew distant with memory. "Our son James had her eyes. He was 4 when they died." Georgina squeezed his hand gently. "Thank you for telling me about them. It's been a long time since I've spoken their names aloud," Preston admitted. "Somehow it hurts less here, with you." The dance ended, and they moved to the edge of the floor, the moment of intimacy lingering between them. Before they could continue their conversation, Malcolm Morris approached, his weathered face creased in a smile. "Irvine, glad you could make it," he said, clapping Preston on the shoulder. "Been meaning to talk to you about that stallion we brought in last week. No one can get near him, but he seemed to take to you." As the men discussed the horse, Georgina found herself watching Preston, noting how easily he conversed with the ranch owner. For a man who claimed to have been drifting for years, he seemed remarkably at ease in this social setting, as if parts of his former self were gradually re-emerging. The evening progressed pleasantly, with Georgina and Preston sharing several more dances. Harold, too, seemed to be enjoying himself, engaged in conversation with old acquaintances who appeared glad to see him sober and employed again. As the celebration wound down, Preston and Georgina stepped outside for some air. The night was clear, stars scattered across the Wyoming sky like diamonds on velvet. "Thank you for coming with me tonight," Preston said, his voice low in the darkness. "I'm glad you asked me," Georgina replied honestly. Preston turned to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight. "I haven't felt this way in a very long time, Georgina. It scares me a little." Georgina's heart raced at his confession. "What way is that?" "Like maybe I could stop running," Preston said softly. "Like maybe there's something worth staying for." Before she could respond, a commotion erupted from inside the barn. Shouts and the sound of breaking glass shattered the peaceful moment. Preston immediately moved toward the disturbance, Georgina close behind. Inside, they found a scene of chaos. Silas Weaver and his gang had arrived, clearly drunk and looking for trouble. Silas himself stood in the center of the floor, a bottle in hand, leering at the gathered townspeople. "Well, ain't this a pretty party?" he slurred. "And we weren't invited." Malcolm Morris stepped forward, his expression grim. "You're not welcome here, Weaver. Take your boys and leave." Silas laughed, an ugly sound. "Or what, old man? You'll set your cowhands on us?" His gaze swept the room, stopping when it landed on Preston and Georgina. A nasty smile spread across his face. "Well, look who it is. The high and mighty drifter who paid Harold Lawson's debts." He spat on the floor. "You think that settles things between us, Irvine?" Preston moved Georgina behind him with a gentle push. "The debt's paid, Weaver. There's nothing more to discuss." "Oh, I think there is," Silas snarled. "You embarrassed me in front of my men. Made me look weak." "You did that all on your own," Preston replied evenly. "Now, like Mr. Morris said, take your men and go." Silas's face contorted with rage. He threw his bottle aside, where it shattered against a support beam. "You think you're better than me? A no-account drifter with nothing but a horse to his name." "I don't think anything about you at all, Weaver," Preston said, his voice dangerously calm. "And that's what really bothers you, isn't it?" With a roar of anger, Silas lunged forward. Preston sidestepped neatly, causing the drunk man to stumble. The other guests scattered, women gathering children, men moving to protect their families. "Stop this!" Malcolm shouted, stepping between the men. "Not in my home, Weaver." Silas pulled a knife from his boot, the blade glinting in the lantern light. "Get out of my way, Morris. This is between me and Irvine." Harold Lawson suddenly appeared at Preston's side, his face set in determination. "No, Weaver. It's between you and me. Always has been. I'm the one who owed you money." "Pa! No," Georgina whispered, fear clutching at her heart. Silas laughed again. "Look at this." Old drunk Lawson found his courage. "Too late, Harold. Your debt might be paid, but I'm still owed satisfaction." Before anyone could react, Silas lunged again, this time at Harold. Preston moved with lightning speed, shoving Harold aside and blocking Silas's attack. The knife sliced through Preston's shirt, drawing a line of blood across his forearm. Several of the ranch hands rushed forward then, overpowering Silas and his men. Malcolm Morris himself landed a solid punch that sent Weaver crashing to the ground. "Someone get the sheriff," Morris ordered. "These men are going to jail tonight." As Silas and his gang were restrained, Georgina rushed to Preston's side, examining his injury with trembling hands. "It's just a scratch," he assured her, though the blood soaking his sleeve suggested otherwise. "You could have been killed," she said, tears threatening to spill. "Both of you," she added, glancing at her father. Harold looked shaken but resolute. "Irvine saved my life. Again." He extended his hand to Preston. "Thank you. I won't forget it." Preston accepted the handshake with a nod. "You'd have done the same." As the sheriff arrived to take Weaver and his men into custody, Eliza Morris insisted on treating Preston's wound. The cut proved deeper than he'd admitted, requiring several stitches, which the rancher's wife administered with practiced efficiency. "You're lucky," she told him as she wrapped a clean bandage around his arm. "A bit deeper and you'd have been in real trouble." The social ended on a subdued note, with guests departing while discussing the excitement in hushed tones. Malcolm Morris insisted on sending one of his hands to escort the Lawsons and Preston home, in case Weaver had any friends still at large. The ride back to the Lawson ranch was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts about the evening's dramatic conclusion. When they arrived, Harold immediately retired to his room, leaving Preston and Georgina alone on the porch. "Let me check your bandage before you go to the barn," Georgina said, her concern evident. Preston followed her inside, where she carefully unwrapped Eliza's handiwork to inspect the wound. Standing close enough to catch the faint scent of lavender in her hair, Preston found it difficult to focus on the pain in his arm. "It looks clean," Georgina said, rewrapping the bandage with gentle fingers. "But you should change this tomorrow." "Thank you," Preston said, his voice rougher than he intended. When she finished, Georgina didn't step back immediately. Their eyes met in the lamplight, and the air between them seemed to thicken. "You could have been killed tonight," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "It would take more than Silas Weaver to kill me," Preston replied, trying for lightness but failing. "Don't joke about such things," Georgina admonished. "I couldn't bear it if—" She trailed off, but her meaning was clear. Preston reached up with his uninjured arm, his fingers gently brushing a stray curl from her face. "Georgina," he said softly, "I haven't cared about staying alive for a long time, not since I lost Emily and James. But tonight, when Weaver pulled that knife—" He paused, struggling to articulate the revelation. "All I could think was that I wanted more time. More time here. More time with you." Georgina's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Preston, slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he leaned down and kissed her. It was gentle, tentative, a question rather than a demand. After a moment of surprise, Georgina responded, her hand coming to rest on his chest, above his rapidly beating heart. When they broke apart, Preston rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed as if memorizing the moment. "I should go," he said reluctantly, "before your father comes looking for me with his shotgun." Georgina laughed softly. "Pa likes you. I think he'd give you a head start at least." Preston smiled, the expression warming his usually solemn features. "Good night, Georgina." "Good night, Preston," she replied, watching as he stepped into the night, his tall figure silhouetted against the stars before he disappeared into the barn. Touching her lips where his had been, Georgina knew with sudden clarity that her life had irrevocably changed the moment Preston Irvine had walked into that church in Lusk. The weeks following the Morris social brought changes to the Lawson Ranch and its inhabitants. With Silas Weaver and his men locked in the Lusk jail awaiting trial for assault, a palpable sense of relief settled over the community. Preston's wound healed quickly, leaving only a thin scar along his forearm. May brought gentle rains that transformed the Wyoming landscape. The pastures around the Lawson Ranch turned lush green, promising good grazing for the small but growing herd that Harold and Preston had begun to assemble. Preston continued to work at the Rocking M during the days, but his evenings were devoted to improving the Lawson property. Harold, too, seemed rejuvenated by honest work and sobriety, gradually reclaiming the man he'd been before grief had consumed him. On a particularly fine Saturday, Preston approached Georgina as she tended her vegetable garden behind the house. "I've been thinking," he began, removing his hat and turning it nervously in his hands, "about what happens when summer ends." Georgina's heart sank. This was the conversation she'd been dreading, the moment when Preston would announce his intention to move on, as he had from every place for the past 6 years. "You're planning to leave," she said, trying to keep her voice steady as she continued pulling weeds with more force than necessary. "No," Preston replied, the single word causing her to look up in surprise. "That's just it, Georgina. For the first time since the war, I don't want to move on when the seasons change." Hope blossomed in Georgina's chest. "You want to stay in Lusk?" "I want to stay with you," Preston clarified, his blue eyes intent on hers. "If you'll have me." Georgina stood slowly, brushing soil from her hands. "Preston Irvine, are you asking what I think you're asking?" A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I'm making a proper mess of it, aren't I?" He took a deep breath. "Georgina Lawson, I love you. I never expected to find love again. Never thought I deserved it after failing to protect Emily and James. But you've shown me that the heart can heal, can grow large enough to honor what was lost while embracing what's found." Tears filled Georgina's eyes as Preston dropped to one knee before her, right there among the budding tomato plants. "I don't have much to offer beyond these 2 hands and a promise to cherish you all the days of my life," he continued, his voice rough with emotion. "But if that's enough, I'm asking you to be my wife." "Yes," Georgina whispered, then louder, "Yes, Preston, yes." Preston rose to his feet, gathering her into his arms with a joy that seemed to radiate from him. When they kissed, it was a promise, a beginning, a declaration of faith in the future they would build together. Later, when they shared their news with Harold, the older man's eyes grew misty, though he tried to hide it with gruff congratulations. "Took you long enough," he told Preston, clapping him on the shoulder. "Been expecting this since the day you rode into that church. You have my blessing," he added more seriously. "Your mother would be happy, Georgie. She always said you deserved a good man." The engagement was set for a modest 3 months, time enough for Preston to complete the improvements he had in mind for the ranch and for Georgina to prepare for their wedding. Word spread quickly through Lusk, and the surrounding ranches. Eliza Morris immediately took charge of wedding preparations, insisting that the ceremony be held at the Rocking M, where there was room for the entire community to celebrate. "It's the social event of the season," she declared when Georgina protested that a simple ceremony would suffice. "And Malcolm and I want to do this for you both. Consider it a wedding gift." As the summer progressed, Preston revealed another surprise. He had been saving most of his wages, combining them with money he'd brought to Lusk, to purchase the abandoned Carlton property that adjoined the Lawson ranch. "It's run down," he admitted as he showed Georgina the overgrown pastures and dilapidated ranch house. "But the land is good. Combined with your 40 acres, we'd have a viable operation." Georgina surveyed the property with practical eyes, seeing past the current neglect to the potential beneath. "It's perfect, Preston. Our own place, but close enough that Pa won't be alone." Their wedding day dawned clear and bright in early September. The Rocking M was transformed with wildflowers and ribbons, the entire community turning out in their Sunday best. Malcolm Morris had even arranged for a minister to travel from Cheyenne for the occasion. In the ranch house, Eliza helped Georgina dress in a gown of ivory satin that the older woman had generously altered from her own daughter's wedding dress. "Something borrowed," Eliza said with a wink as she fastened the last button. "Though I don't think Beth will be wanting it back." Georgina's hair was arranged in soft curls, topped with a crown of white prairie roses. Her mother's cameo, polished to a high shine, adorned her throat. "You look beautiful, dear," Eliza said, stepping back to admire her handiwork. "That cowboy of yours won't know what hit him." Harold appeared at the bedroom door, looking almost unrecognizable in a new suit and freshly trimmed hair. His eyes widened at the sight of his daughter. "Georgie," he breathed, "you're the image of your mother on our wedding day." Georgina embraced him, careful not to wrinkle her dress. "She'd be proud of you too, Pa, of how far you've come." Harold cleared his throat, blinking rapidly. "Well, there's a nervous groom waiting out there. Shall we?" The ceremony was simple but beautiful, held beneath an arch of twisted branches and flowers at the edge of the Morrises' garden. Preston stood waiting, more handsome than Georgina had ever seen him in a dark suit and crisp white shirt. The look on his face when he saw her walking toward him on her father's arm was one Georgina knew she would treasure for the rest of her life. Wonder, joy, and love so powerful it seemed to transform his entire being. Their vows were traditional but spoken with such conviction that many guests found themselves wiping away tears. When the minister pronounced them man and wife, Preston's kiss was both tender and full of promise. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with dancing, feasting, and many toasts to the happy couple. Even the usually reserved Malcolm Morris took to the floor, waltzing gracefully with his wife of 30 years. As twilight deepened into true darkness, lanterns were lit around the yard, casting a magical glow over the proceedings. Preston led Georgina away from the crowd to a quiet spot beneath an old cottonwood tree. "Happy, Mrs. Irvine?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she replied honestly. "And you?" Preston's answer was to kiss her again, a kiss that spoke of the future they would build together, the children they hoped for, the life they would share. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small wooden box, intricately carved with a pattern of leaves and flowers. "It's beautiful," Georgina said, tracing the carvings with her fingertip. "Open it," Preston urged gently. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a delicate gold locket. Georgina gasped as she lifted it out, opening it to find a tiny portrait of Preston on one side. "The other side is for our first child," he explained, his voice husky with emotion. "I wanted you to have something that represents both our past and our future." Tears of happiness spilled onto Georgina's cheeks as Preston fastened the locket around her neck, where it nestled just above her mother's cameo. I never imagined I could be this happy again, he confessed, wiping her tears away with his thumb. When I lost Emily and James, I thought that part of my life was over forever. But you, Georgina, you showed me that the heart can heal, can grow large enough for new love without diminishing what came before. I'll treasure it always, Georgina promised, touching the locket. Just as I'll treasure you. Their first months as husband and wife passed in a blur of hard work and profound happiness. They moved into the Carleton homestead, which Preston had worked tirelessly to restore. The main house was simple but comfortable, with a new roof, repaired walls, and windows that sparkled in the sunlight. Harold remained in the Lawson home, though he spent many evenings with them, often bringing his fiddle to play after supper, while Preston accompanied him on guitar. These impromptu concerts became some of Georgina's favorite moments, watching the two men who meant everything to her sharing the universal language of music. Winter came early that year, with November bringing the first heavy snows. The three of them spent the long evenings by the fire, Preston reading aloud from the small collection of books they'd accumulated, or simply talking about their plans for the ranch come spring. It was during one such evening, as snow piled against the windows and the fire crackled in the hearth, that Georgina shared her news. I think we'll need to prepare the small bedroom sooner than we planned, she said, her hand unconsciously moving to rest on her still flat stomach. Preston looked up from the book he'd been reading, comprehension dawning slowly across his face. Georgina, are you saying? She nodded, unable to contain her smile. Dr. Matthews confirmed it yesterday. We're going to have a baby, Preston, in early summer. The book fell forgotten as Preston crossed the room in two long strides, gathering her into his arms with a whoop of joy that startled Harold from his doze by the fire. What in tarnation? The older man exclaimed, blinking in confusion. You're going to be a grandfather, Pa, Georgina said, laughing through happy tears as Preston spun her around the room. Harold's weathered face split into a wide grin. Well, I'll be. That's the best news I've heard in an age. That night, as they lay together in their bed, Preston's hand rested protectively over Georgina's abdomen, as if already shielding the tiny life growing within. Are you afraid? He asked softly, knowing that childbirth in Wyoming could be dangerous. Georgina covered his hand with her own. A little, she admitted, but mostly I'm happy and grateful. Preston kissed her temple. I'll make sure you have the best care possible. Dr. Matthews is good, and Eliza Morris delivered half the children in the county before he arrived. I'm not worried, Georgina assured him. This baby is a blessing, Preston. A sign that God heard my prayer that day in the church, even when others laughed. Preston was quiet for a moment, reflecting on the strange twist of fate that had brought him to Lusk, to that church, at precisely the moment Georgina had needed him. I wasn't a praying man before I met you, he said finally, but I think someone was looking out for both of us that day. The months of Georgina's pregnancy passed with a mixture of anticipation and hard work. Preston threw himself into preparing for both the baby and the spring calving season, determined that their small ranch would provide a secure future for their growing family. Harold, too, seemed rejuvenated by the prospect of a grandchild. He spent hours crafting a cradle from pine, carving delicate patterns along its edges. When not working at the Rocking M or helping with the cattle, he could often be found in his small workshop, creating wooden toys and trinkets for the baby. By May, Georgina's condition had become pronounced, her slim figure now graced with the unmistakable roundness of advanced pregnancy. Dr. Matthews visited regularly, always reassuring them that everything was progressing normally. Strong heartbeat, he pronounced during his late May visit. And the baby's positioned well. I'd expect your little one to arrive within the next 2 weeks, Mrs. Irvine. As if proving the doctor right, Georgina's labor began in the early hours of June 2, 1875. Preston sent Harold galloping toward town to fetch the doctor, then set about making Georgina as comfortable as possible, his usual calm demeanor betrayed by the worry in his eyes. "It's all right," Georgina assured him between contractions. "Women have been doing this since the beginning of time." "Not my woman," Preston replied, his voice tight with concern as he wiped her brow with a cool cloth. Dr. Matthews arrived with remarkable speed, immediately taking charge of the situation. He shooed Preston from the bedroom with instructions to boil water and prepare clean linens. The labor progressed steadily throughout the morning and into the afternoon. Preston paced the small parlor, alternating between prayer and quiet conversation with Harold, who sat whittling by the window, his own anxiety evident in the rapid movement of his knife. As the sun began its descent, a cry pierced the tense atmosphere, the unmistakable wail of a newborn taking its first breath. Preston froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. Minutes that felt like hours passed before Dr. Matthews emerged, his tired face split by a wide smile. "Congratulations, Mr. Irvine," he said, clapping Preston on the shoulder. "You have a healthy son." Preston swayed slightly, steadied by Harold's hand on his arm. "And Georgina?" he managed to ask. "Tired but well," the doctor assured him. "She's asking for you." Preston entered the bedroom on unsteady legs. Georgina lay propped against pillows, her face pale but radiant, cradling a small bundle wrapped in white linen. She looked up as he approached, her smile brighter than he'd ever seen it. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Preston sat gently on the edge of the bed, peering down at the tiny red face nestled against Georgina's breast. The baby's eyes were closed, his miniature features scrunched in the universal expression of newborns. "He's perfect," Preston whispered, afraid to touch this miracle for fear he might break him. "Would you like to hold him?" Georgina asked, already shifting the bundle toward his arms. With trembling hands, Preston accepted his son, cradling him awkwardly at first, then with growing confidence. The baby's eyes fluttered open, revealing dark blue irises that would likely lighten with time. "Hello, little one," Preston said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm your pa." The baby seemed to study him, his gaze strangely focused for a newborn. Then, as if satisfied with what he saw, he closed his eyes again, settling comfortably in his father's arms. "What shall we call him?" Georgina asked. Preston looked at his wife, the woman who had restored his faith in life and love. "I thought perhaps Harold, after your father." Georgina's eyes filled with tears. "Harold James Irvine," she suggested, "to honor both the men who watch over us." Preston nodded, too overcome to speak. In that moment, he understood that the circle of love and loss that defined life had completed itself. The pain of losing his first son would always be part of him, but it was now balanced by the joy of this new beginning. Harold was summoned to meet his namesake, the gruff old rancher rendered speechless at the sight of the tiny boy who bore his name. He touched the baby's cheek with a weathered finger, his eyes suspiciously bright. "Well done, Georgie," he said finally. "Your mother would be so proud." As twilight deepened into night, Dr. Matthews departed with promises to return the following day. Harold retired to his own cabin, leaving the new family to their privacy. Preston settled into a chair beside the bed, watching as Georgina nursed their son, the tender scene illuminated by the soft glow of the bedside lamp. "Thank you," he said simply when she looked up at him. "For what?" Georgina asked. "For praying that day in the church," Preston replied. "For giving me a reason to stop running. For this." He gestured to encompass their son, their home, the life they'd built together. Georgina reached out to take his hand. "And thank you for arriving before I opened my eyes." As night settled fully over the Wyoming plains, the small family rested in the peace of their home. Outside, stars scattered across the vast sky, witnessing the timeless cycle of love, loss, and renewal that had brought Preston Irvine to Lusk, to that church, to the woman whose prayer had set them both on an unexpected path to healing and joy. In the years that followed, the Irvine Ranch flourished. The combined Lawson and Carlton properties provided ample grazing for their growing herd, and Preston's skill with horses brought additional income as he bred and trained stock for neighboring ranches. Young Harold James, called Harry by his family, grew into a sturdy, curious boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's auburn hair. He was joined 2 years after his birth by a sister, Elizabeth, and named for both Preston's mother and Georgina's. Harold Sr. remained a vital part of their lives, doting on his grandchildren and continuing to work alongside Preston until age began to slow his steps. Even then, he found ways to contribute, teaching Harry to ride and fish, sharing stories of the early days in Wyoming territory. Preston and Georgina's love deepened with each passing year, tempered by the challenges of ranch life, but strengthened by the family they had created together. On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the day's work complete, they would sometimes sit on their porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in hues of gold and crimson. "Do you ever think about that day in the church?" Preston asked one such evening, as they celebrated their 10th wedding anniversary. "How different our lives might have been if I hadn't ridden into Lusk when I did." Georgina leaned against his shoulder, her hand finding his as naturally as breathing. "Sometimes, but I prefer to think that we were always meant to find each other. That no matter what path we took, we would have arrived at this place, this life, together." Preston smiled, raising her hand to his lips. "I believe you're right, Mrs. Irvine. Some things are just meant to be." Inside the house, their children slept peacefully, the next generation of a family forged from chance, choice, and the enduring power of a prayer that had been answered before its speaker's eyes were opened. And on the distant horizon, where the vast Wyoming plains met the endless sky, the future stretched before them, as boundless and full of promise as the frontier itself.